Inspector Val was giving Mr. Sorg his views on East Side crime, considered in the connection with those nationalities dominant of that feverish region, the Italian and Russian Jew. In the midst of the convincing period, Mr. Bowles interrupted the discussion. "Inspector," said Mr. Bowles, "there's a man outside, quite excited. He is, who says he must see you at once. He declined to state his business. The name he gave is Burks, Mr. Burks." "Burks?" repeated Inspector Val. "Never heard of it. However, show him in. I shall be glad if there's foundation for his excitement, as I feel like stretching my mental legs." Mr. Burks was a globular person of middle age and farmerish looks. He wore a catskin cap, had not been new in years. For all his looks of agriculture, Mr. Burks did not have the air of independence that belongs with one who plows and plants his own acres. Rather, he resembled a man who tilled the estate of some rich overling to whom his attitude was the attitude of the service. His moon-like face showed anxiety and fright. Inspector Val pushed a chair toward him, and Mr. Burks sat down on the edge. "Take your time, Mr. Burks," said Inspector Val, for he saw that his visitor was a bit shaken, either by his police surroundings or the story he had come to tell. "Take your time." Inspector Val had the gift, manner, and eye and tone of inspiring nervous folk with confidence. A look of partial comfort stole into the broad visage of Mr. Burks. He heaved a sigh as though his burdens were already lighter. "Tell me your story," continued Inspector Val, "for I can see that you have one to tell." "Aye," said Mr. Burks, with a touch of Devonshire in his accents. "Aye, I've a story for sure. Let me begin this way. Me and Mrs. keeps Judge Bannister's country house through the winter, sort of caretakers like. You may know where it is, sir. Fordham Heights, on the Westchester side of Harlem. Well, there's nobody in the house since November but me and my missus, and a coachman kind of fellow of the name of James Settle. He looked after a pair of horses and 5 cows that were being wintered at the place. That wasn't much to do. Get up the firewood, feed the horses and cows, and milk the latter. In short, do chores like that. It was last night about 10 o'clock, and Jim, that's what me and the missus call Settle, started for the barn to shake down a lock of hay for the horses. It's a goodish stretch from the house to the barn, and when Jim was about 100 yards from the house, say within 20 yards of the barn, I heard him give a screech. It was an awful screech. Not so loud, mind you, but just a sort that sends a shiver along your skin. For all it scared me faint, I ran to the back door. Me and the missus was sitting in the kitchen, but it was too late. Jim was gone. Gone? Where had he gone? That I don't know, sir. Mr. Burks lowered his voice as though puzzled and terrified. It was like glamour or witchery. Jim went away through the air. Inspector Val shot a swift glance at Mr. Burks. Was his caller crazy? Or was it merely the spell of a strong drink? Clearly neither. What makes you say that Settle went away through the air? Because it was from up high his voice sounded. His voice? Yes, sir. He called to me twice. What sort of cry? Terror? Why, yes, terror, sir. But we spoke words too. He says, "Oh, it's got me." And then a little later, further away, "It's got me." That was the last I heard. What did you do next? Well, me and the missus closed the door and sat down without speaking a word. We sat there quite a spell, for he was main frightened. Then I begun to get a little courage. I lit the lantern and said I'd go see what had happened to Jim. "And you started for the barn?" Yes. I held the lantern low and kept following Jim's tracks to see where they ended, and if any queer marks of whatever took him would show in the snow. You remember it snowed an inch or so about 8 o'clock last night. That made it very easy to follow Jim's tracks, as they were the first that had been made since the storm. You didn't walk in the tracks? Oh, no. I walked to one side, as I did my missus who came with me. Jim's tracks are there yet for anybody to see. Good. As I said, about 100 yards from the house, the tracks ended. There was a lot of footprints in the snow, but they had all been made by Jim. It was as though he struggled against being borne away. "Last night," said Inspector Val, as though confirming a point of weather. After the storm had ceased to fall, it was dark and still, quite night. "Aye, a dark, still night, sir. And your story, as I understand it, at 10 o'clock, while Settle was on his way to the barn, some things or creatures swooped down on him. What else? These were his tracks, as plain as life, walking out into the snow. Of a sudden, they end without turning back. Then after the first screech, he called me twice from out up in the air. A goodish piece up he was. The last time, too, I could but hear him. And his words were, 'It's got me,' precisely. 'Oh, it's got me,' he cries. Then again, 'It's got me.' I'll not forgotten, for it makes me shudder to my heart." "But with the night so still, didn't you hear any other sound?" "There was a dull beating of wings, maybe," said Mr. Burks, again sinking his voice and glancing furtively about. "At least it sounded like wings, a great muffled, heavy flutter of something." "Do you believe in ghosts, Mr. Burks?" "Now, I don't exactly know neither," returned Mr. Burks, a trifle shamed, but dogged. "And isn't Jim being taken away like the works of a witch or a warlock, something demonic, to put it to the fairest?" "What did you say, Sorg?" asked Inspector Val, willing his assistant, who had heard Mr. Burks with greedy ears. "Are you for demonology?" "The condor," said Mr. Sork solemnly, as though recited from a book, "the condor of the Andes is the largest bird of prey in the world. Haven't they got a condor in the Bronx Zoo?" "Dismiss the condor, Sorg," said Investor Val, beginning to laugh. "The biggest condor on the tallest peak of the Andes would find it work cut out to manage 30 pounds, travelers' tales to the contrary notwithstanding. There never was a bird large enough and strong enough to carry off a man since the great rock helped Sinbad the sailor out of the Valley of Diamonds." Then to Mr. Burks, "I think I'll go out to the Bannister place with you." "I wish you would. I'd take it very kindly, sir. Surely something ought to be done about Jim." "Assuredly. We must puzzle out this riddle. Nothing will have obliterated those tracks. Oh, no. My missus wouldn't stay that when I left. She went to the neighbors, and there's been no one at the place to destroy the tracks." "I'll go alone," Sorg observed. Inspector Val, looking at his watch. "Have you adopted my any theory?" asked Mr. Sorg. "I never adopt a theory. I wait for a theory to adopt me." The Bannister place was a great stone house. The barn was distant about 30 rods from the house. The grounds were, in shape, a long rectangle and measured 40 acres. There was shrubbery and bushes and a few small trees about the house. In a far corner of the grounds to the west was a clump of native forest trees, full-grown maples and beeches and oaks. The snow-ridden expanse between the house and the barn lay open, and the free of trees and shrubs, being in the summer given over to the flower beds and grass. The house, with the barn a little to the north and west of it, stood on a point of the land high above the Harlem River, of which one could get a shimmering glimpse through the bare wintered stripped trees. From the house westward, the land fell sharply to an old road running north and south. This road marked the western boundary of the Bannister domain. Between the road and the river, separated from the road by a thickly wooded strip, was a railway track. Mr. Burks had not erred in any particular concerning the trail in the snow. There, as obvious as a page of print, the white snow showed where Settle had walked toward the barn. Then of a sudden the end came in a confused flurry of tracks, not many, not running away, but all collected within a diameter of 4 feet, and telling of what horror and stampede of which Settle must have tasted before he was carried off. His fate, too, whatever it was, had come upon him like a clap of thunder. He neither saw nor heard it in its descent, for the tracks, up to the point of disappearance, showed measured and steady, as though the mind of him who had made them were at a tranquil ease. Directly westward from where the tracks ended, the distant 200 feet, was a thick-burrowed dogwood tree. The dogwood stood alone, the only notable feature in which in July days would be a lawn. Inspector Val, after a glance at Settle's tracks, considered the dogwood briefly, as though he had fancied it might have some connection with the enigma he was trying to solve. But in the end, his eyes came back to the footprints of the lost man. He bent over them long and thoughtfully. The situation possessed a sinister savor. This even procession of tracks, and then to mysteriously end as though he had made them, had been snuffed away without warning. Inspector Val examined track after track to make certain that Settle and some crazy or criminal freak had not maneuvered a return back, walking backward, setting each foot in the prints made in coming. No such miracle of pedestrianism had been performed. The imprints told of but one pressure of the foot, no more. Inspector Val called Mr. Burke's attention to the fact that the trail ran unalarmed and steady up to the small circumscribed flurry of terror that told the end. "It is as open as a book," he said, "that Settle had never a breath of warning. How come it then that you 20 rods or more away could hear a dull beating of wings?" "Jim was very deaf, sir. You had to shout to make him hear. My missus, her voice, not being overstrong, couldn't talk with him at all." Mr. Burks, observing the coming of her husband and the Inspector Val, had returned from the neighbors. Inspector Val had got a glimpse of her through the kitchen window. "Remain here," he said to Mr. Burks. Mrs. Burks did not offer those rotund, pleasant proportions that distinguished her good man. She was thin, with a shy black eye, and looked a year or two further along than did Mr. Burks. She bobbled an old-fashioned curtsy to Inspector Val, who addressed her directly. "Mr. Burks and I were talking of Settle. Had you known him long?" "I should say the better part of a year," Mrs. Burks spoke in a bird-like tremble. "Was he companionable? Did he talk much?" "No, sir. He was a silent man, though it may have been his hearing. It was hard to make him hear, sir. A body couldn't make much talk with him." That question of deafness seemed answered, and Inspector Val turned away to Mr. Burks, who had remained near the barn. As he stepped from the kitchen door, he observed that Mr. Burks was in talks with the stranger. Both Mr. Burks and the stranger seemed quite excited. They met him midway between house and barn. "This is Mr. Stearns, sir," said Mr. Burks hurriedly. "A neighbor down the hill. He found Settle, sir. He's dead by the railway track," broke in Mr. Stearns, who was no one to let another to tell his news for him. "My cow, Bossy, was out along the track, and I was feared for her. So I says to my wife, Betsy, I'll go drive up Bossy. I ain't got no 50 yards when I see a bundle of rags ahead lying by the rails. At first, I think it's baggage from a train, but when I gets to it, there it is, Mr. Jim Settle, sure enough, only I'd never known the face, which was past all recognizing. It must have been the train struck him, Burks, concluded Mr. Stearns. "Lead us to the place," said Inspector Val. Settle's body lay by the railway track, but as much under the lee of a sharp embankment as to be out of sight from the train. It was rigid and cold. Both body and limbs were so twisted as to show that not a sound bone remained in the skin. The snow was about 2 inches deep, and 3 feet from where the body lay, clued up in a broken heap, was a great splotch, as though the body had originally struck there and then bounded from the hard frozen earth to its present position. The snow, for 6 inches about the body, was red with the ooze of blood. As Mr. Stearns had stated, the features were not to be recognized. The clothes were enough, however. Mr. Burks, as well as Mrs. Stearns, knew them from the clothes of Settle. While the body was crushed and bruised and every bone broken, there was but one rent in the clothing. The coat had been ripped and the tear extending from the collar backward, and downward over the right shoulder to a place near the small of the back. Not alone the coat, but the waistcoat and thick woolen shirt of the dead man were correspondingly tore, and a ragged gash gaped in the back and shoulders muscles where the flesh was laid open to the bone. Inspector Val made a most minute examination. When he straightened up, he had his eye admiringly on Mr. Stearns. This is the most important discovery. Mr. Stearns swelled with pride, being a true royalist, and was elated to thus find himself a center of interest in encomium. Since it was you who had found the body, it is your privilege to notify the coroner. The nearest telephone station will call him. Mr. Stearns was off like an arrow. He did not propose to lose one syllable of that celebration, which should belong to the first and weighty witness of the inquest. "You said nothing, I hope," observed Inspector Val and Mr. Burks when they were again alone, "as to the matter of the Settle's disappearance." "Not a word. My suggestion is that you keep silent until you have further word from me. It may not come for a week. You'd better remain by the body until the coroner arrives." Inspector Val scribbled a line on one of his cards. The card read, "Inspector Val, Central Office, Mulberry Street." Underneath was written, "To Coroner. Please postpone finding until you've talked with me. V." "Give the coroner that," he said to Mr. Burks, as the latter took the card. "Don't answer questions or say aught of the happenings of the last night. I like to keep these matters dark. To turn on a half light might defeat our search." Mr. Burks closed his lips firmly, as one who had decided to remain mute in the face of every query. Mr. Sorg met his chief more than once during the next 7 days, but was too well trained to be guilty of the grievous error of putting questions. By suggestion of Inspector Val, the coroner had had one hearing, and had taken the testimony of the rustical Mr. Stearns. It was a tremendous moment for that bumpkin, albeit all he could say was that whilst in quest for the errant Bossy, he came across the body. He volunteered a belief that death was caused by the night express. Also, he identified the remains as Settle's by the clothes, and in support of his express train theory, remembered how Settle was dull of ear. "He was as deaf as an adder of Scripture, Your Honor," said Mr. Stearns with a bow to the coroner. The functionary followed the evidence of Mr. Stearns, adjourned the inquiry a fortnight. It was 1 week to the hour after Mr. Burke's visit to Mulberry Street when Inspector Val sent to Mr. Sorg. "Sorg," he said in his official tone, "this afternoon at sharp 2, you will please be at the 25th Street door of the Hoffman. I shall come out to the hotel by the door with a gentleman. To avoid mistakes, as I pass you, I'll identify him by calling him Mr. Notes. We will separate at the door. You are then to shadow him to his home, wherever it is. It may be that he lives out of town, so maybe be ready to ride a train. Having followed him to his home by the way of making sure, wait a half hour to see if he comes out. At the end of the half hour, rap at the door and ask whether Mr. Seaton resides here. The reply in all chance will be in the affirmative. Thereupon elaborate a bit and say, Mr. Erasmus Seaton of number 2 Wall. The answer to this must inevitably be no, for unless the city directory is a work of fiction, Mr. Erasmus Seaton of number 2 Wall lives at the Netherlands. Having gotten your answer no, explain that you were misdirected and return to me. 2 o'clock found Mr. Sorg at the 25th Street door of the Hoffman. There were several loitering about, and a more or less coming and going of cabs, so there was a small risk of the broad-shouldered, commonplace Mr. Sorg, in the cap and pea-jacket, being identified as a member of the city's secret police. Making provision for every possibility that might attend this man's departure, he ordered a coup to stand ready across the street. 15 minutes, half an hour, 3/4 went by. Still no Inspector Val. The mercury was about freezing. The streets a slush with snow. This made the air damp and raw. Mr. Sword planted himself inside the double doors, from which position he could watch both hotel and street, and also avoid the weather. At 3 o'clock, across the hall from Mr. Sorg, the door of the elevator slammed upon the Inspector Val got out. He was followed by a lean, little rat-faced man whose sallow cheek and lank, iron-gray locks hanging down to his shoulders were in keeping with the stoop that almost bent his thin frame double. One claw-like hand carried the cane wherewith he supported his shuffling steps, while the other, long, meager, like the talons of a bird, clutched at a thick shawl wrapped closely about the throat. The shawl, being voluminous, hung down about the starved flanks, and the coat tails and trousers visible below its fringe were black and rusty. As the pair passed, Mr. Sorg, Inspector Val observed, "Then, Mr. Notes, you are unable to say just when I shall have the pleasure of seeing your great device." "Sir," replied the little rat-faced man, "it is impossible to name the day at this time. However, you will probably hear from me. Meanwhile," and the little rat-faced man bowed and smirked in an amazing fashion, "I am under a world of obligations for this meeting. If you should return to London, Professor, before we meet again, write me to the care of the St. Denis as you did today, and tell me what advancement you are making." "Believe me," returned Inspector Val as he pressed the bird claw hand, "I shall surely see you before I see London. But if you don't, then I shall write." Mr. Sorg's cool precautions were well taken, for the little rat-faced man signaled a hansom. Inspector Val helped him in, which did not please him. He hesitated, and then, since he must have given that direction, drive to the 23rd Street ferry, North River. Away rattled the little rat-faced man. After him, not 100 feet behind, rattled Mr. Sorg. Inspector Val saw them fairly off. Then, lighting a cigar, he turned and strolled down Broadway. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Inspector Val sauntered into his rooms in the Mulberry Street. "Any word from Sorg?" he asked. The officer on the night desk said Mr. Sorg had phoned that he had been in at 10 o'clock. "It's as I thought," mused Inspector Val, divesting himself of his street coat. "My weasel-visaged friend's home isn't far away." At 10 o'clock, Mr. Sorg appeared. From the splashes of mud on his person, it was clear that he had been doing a mile or so of country road afoot. "Well," said Inspector Val, composing himself comfortably on the lounge, "you heard the guy say 23rd Street ferry," began Mr. Sorg, pulling up a chair. "That was a blind. At 8th Avenue, he ordered his hansom about and went to Sherry's. There's he dismissed, and after a wait of 5 minutes, took a Sherry electric cab to the Majestic. Paying off the electric, he shuffled his way to the elevated station, 9th Avenue and 72nd Street, and caught an uptown train. He left that train to 125th Street and took the surface cars of the Fort Lee Ferry House. There he crossed the river. A colored lad drove an old rockaway buggy, and the horse, ready to fall dead with age, was waiting. "Ah," he observed Inspector Val, lighting a cigar, "I begin to see how you collected those splashes of mud. You begin to see that I was in for a rough time on the muddy Jersey roads. I was growing dark, and for a moment I was bothered. It began to look as though I should have to follow the ramshackle rockaway on foot. Keeping it in sight would have been no more trouble than keeping a hearse in sight. But as you surmise, the Jersey roads were not inviting. However, some luck was with me. An express wagon had just dumped a consignment of packages at the ferry house, and I gave the boy who drove it $1 to take the same road with the rockaway. I said nothing about the rockaway particularly, but spoke of a country brother off in the direction it was going, whom I was about to surprise with a visit. The boy knew nothing of the old party in the rockaway, for I put the question. He was a dull boy, and since I was asked about 50 questions, he wasn't particularly impressed by the one about the Rockaway. Your party drove to a cottage 3 miles from Fort Lee. He went into the cottage while the darky drove around to the barn. From the way your party let himself in with his own key, I make no question of his living there. Did he act as though he feared he might be followed? Not after he reached the Majestic. Up to that time, he had been sticking his head out the window and squinting back at every cross street. What's next? After the party got home, I let my boy drive on another half-mile. I was looking for a house in which to install my brother. The country round about Fort Lee is somewhat primeval, and the houses are far and few between. At last I saw a light across the little hollow. Who lives there? I ask. As usual, the boy doesn't know. Wonderfully dull boy. Well, then, I say, it's my brother. You can leave me here, as I don't want even the rattle of the wagon wheel to notify him in advance of the joyful surprise that's in store. With that, I quit of my express boy. When he was well on his way back to Fort Lee, I returned to the cottage. The windows had been dark. Now I found them all lit up. There being no dogs, I scouted the situation, front and rear. It's a one-story cottage, counting the kitchen. I don't figure more than 4 rooms. The colored boy was in the kitchen cooking supper. I could make him out through the window. In the same way, I got a flash of your party, busy in the front room, over sheets of paper, stooping occasionally to a bit of mathematics on a slate. Ah, I see, laughed Inspector Val. He was measuring up algebraically certain rules I gave him. After I sized up the place, I gave the door a thump with my stick. There being neither bell nor knocker, the colored boy opened it. As he did so, I whiffed of a broiled ham, floated forth, and I had hardest work to keep from inviting myself to supper. However, I restrained the impulse, and as you directed, inquired of Mr. Seaton, and lived there. Yes, sir, says the boy. Mr. Erasmus Seaton of number 2 wall? I ask. No, sir, not Mr. Erasmus, but Mr. Daniel Seaton, he says. Then I got the wrong stir, says I, and headed for you. There was a barn, you say. It was more like a low shed. Were the house and shed all? There should have been a third building. Now you mention it, there was. It stood back in the little valley. I saw it as I scouted it to the rear of the cottage before I went to the door. What was it like? It was dark, and I didn't go near it. From the outlines as they showed against the snow-covered slope beyond, it was of a fairish height, with a gable roof. I took it to be another barn. Inspector Val looked at his watch. It was 11 o'clock. He began pulling on his overcoat for the street. Meet me here, said he, at 4 tomorrow afternoon. A lively team should land us at Fort Lee's friends by 6. You and I will pay him a visit. Chapter 2. Inspector Val had 2 weaknesses, books and horses. The latter fad was in evidence the next day when, at the hour and set for the meeting between himself and Mr. Sorg, a pair of slashing bays driven by a black coachman and drawing a stanhope came dancing into the Mulberry Street and halted at the central office door. A moment later, Inspector Val and Mr. Sorg were bowling along for Fort Lee Ferry, crossing Stanhope and all to the Fort Lee side of the river. Under the pilotage of Mr. Sorg, they struck northward on the country road. The day had been clear, but with enough of frost to dispose of the vexatious question of mud. Altogether, the drive, so far from being a hardship, was pleasant enough. In confirmation of this, Mr. Sorg was moved to observe, "This is a decided improvement on yesterday." Inspector Val mumbled an assent. Plainly, his mind was running, and whatever business had brought him to the wrong side of the Hudson. It was characteristic of those close yet queer relations which subsisted between Inspector Val and Mr. Sorg that the former hadn't spoken a word which could be tortured into furnishing even the shadow of an inference as to what was the purpose of their trip, nor, on his taciturn part, had Mr. Sorg put a single interrogatory. Mr. Sorg had learned many lessons during his rough and tumble life. Most of all, he had learned the lessons of Inspector Val. That nervously peculiar gentleman had an angry horror of the congenital cross-examiner. Questions and question-mongers were his pet aversion. Wherefore Mr. Sorg was wont to humor this weakness of his chief, and the latter, while loving Mr. Sorg for his iron-bound virtue of courage and a lion-like strength, loved him most for his wordlessness, that spoke never to interrogate, and only when there was something to tell. The cottage the two came seeking was not on the main road, but down a lane to the left. Mr. Sorg said that it was a quarter of a mile from the road. On receiving the news, Inspector Val halted the stanhope at the mouth of the lane, and the two left it with word that it would follow in 20 minutes and wait in front of the cottage, the far twinkling lights of which Mr. Sorg pointed out. The pair would do the short balance of their journey on foot. The cottage was that small one-story structure which Mr. Sorg had described. The new moon sent down enough light from a sky without a cloud to show it half luminous and unpainted. Before going to the cottage, Inspector Val scrutinized the region around it. "Is that the third building you spoke of?" he asked. Mr. Sorg pointed where the ridgepole showed dimly above the knoll. "Yes, it stands in the hollow beyond the swell." Inspector Val leaped the fence. Mr. Sorg followed more heavily. The walk of 40 rods across a pasture brought them to the crest of a knoll. The building that interested them lay immediately at its foot. Like the cottage, it was unpainted, and while of more recent construction, and had the same gray, storm-beaten, weather-stained appearance. Inspector Val descended the slope for the closer study. The building possessed a decidedly queer appearance, and was overlong for its width, being about 15 by 40. The height, too, was considerable, measuring full 30 feet to the eaves. In the center, the sharp gable made it 8 feet or more. Strangest of all, there wasn't a sign of door or window. Inspector Val, upon a closer examination, called Mr. Sorg's eye to the fact that one entire end of the building was made up of 2 leaves of a great double door. When they were thrown open, and it was as though that end had been taken out. These doors were held fast against present investigation by double padlocks. All this could be observed in the pale partial light of the young moon. That, however, was the limit of observation, for while these were cracks of widths and merit between the up and down barn boards which constituted the walls, it was far too dark to talk of seeing what might be housed within. After holding his ineffectual eye to the crack for a whole minute, Mr. Sorg gave it up. He appealed to Inspector Val with a gesture of impatience. "What do you say, Chief? Shall I get a rail from the yonder fence and knock a board off?" "Why should you knock a board off?" "To see what's inside." "Well, I know what's inside. I knew before we left Mulberry Street." Then, as though unable to longer withstand Mr. Sorg's eyes, "This is the cage of your condor of the Andes." Mr. Sorg looked wistfully, but with puzzled face, at the building. Inspector Val touched him on the shoulder and pointed towards the cottage. "Let us have a talk with the owner. I've no doubt he'll satisfy your curiosity by touching the largest bird of prey in the world. I think I can promise you a glimpse of it." It was half a minute's walk. As they approached, they made out, through the window, the little rat-faced man, busy over a draughting table. The room in which he worked was brilliantly lighted, and they could see him plainly. "That's the way he was last night," said Mr. Sorg. Mr. Sorg's rap brought the colored lad to the door. The moment the door was open, Inspector Val stepped inside. Being inside, he addressed the surprised darky. "Say to Mr. Seaton that Professor Reed desires to speak with him." The room in which the rat-faced little man was busy with compass, tri-square, and draughting pen opened off the hall, where Inspector Val and Mr. Sorg stood waiting. "Professor Reed," they heard him exclaim in his harsh, crackling tones. There was a note of surprise and annoyance, almost of alarm. After a pause, as though mentally considering Professor Reed, he came into the hall. "There are two of you," he cried, startled by the sight of Mr. Sorg. "Permit me, Mr. Seton," said Inspector Val blandly, "to present Mr. Sorg of the New York Central Office." The little rat-faced man stared at Mr. Sorg, saying never a word, but with less of fear than wonder in his manner. "This is remarkable," he rasped out at last, and then, as though a sudden thought had struck him, he shifted his beady eye toward Inspector Val. "How did you know my name?" "You may guess when I advise you never to attempt an alias by merely spelling your own name backwards. Besides being vulgar, as the most commonplace trick of criminals of inferior stamp, it fails of the concealment aimed at 9 times in 10. The little rat-faced man stood open-mouthed before Inspector Val. The latter went on, "Come on, Mr. Seton. Do yourself credit and invite Mr. Sorg and myself into your study." The little rat-faced man held his ground, darting glances of suspicion. "You spoke of my alias notes," said he. "Now, on my part, I don't think you're Professor Reed." "Quite right, too," responded Inspector Val affably. "Like Mr. Sorg, I'm of the detective police. You may call me Inspector Val. May I now renew my hint about your study?" "Then you aren't an aeronaut?" The little rat-faced man got this off as though the thought gave him decided relief. "Let me assure you, Mr. Seton, that I shall never soar higher than I can be carried on the wings of stones and mortar." "And you've not come to spy upon my ideas, steal my inventions? Such a larceny is much beyond our purpose, as it would be impossible to our moral natures." The little rat-faced man glanced brightly and quickly with his gimlet eyes from the Inspector Val to Mr. Sorg and back to Inspector Val. His survey seemed to reassure him. He led the way without more parley into the room where he had been at work. It was a pleasant room. A wood fire snapped and crackled in the fireplace. There was a rough pine table, such as architects use, and 3 or 4 heavy chairs. In a corner stood the model of an electric engine, the whole culminating in a great 4-winged fan of the sort employed for cooling rooms, only larger. On the walls hung a dozen drawings of balloons and airships, from the globular variety to the long cigar-shaped contrivance. Mr. Sorg took in these features with a single keen sweep of his eyes, and then established himself near the door, it being instinctive with Mr. Sorg, whatever the occasion, to cut off everybody's retreat. Inspector Val, with an easier grace, drew a chair towards the open fire. "May I light a cigar?" he asked. It was surprising how, in the moment, that bent and shuffling little rat-faced man had thawed. He beamed as he answered, "Oh, certainly, sir. I beg you will make yourself at home, and let me defend my hospitality by having a bottle of wine." The little rat-faced man beat the floor smartly with his cane. In response to this unusual signal, the darky boy appeared, bearing a bottle of Burgundy, as carefully as though it were a child asleep. The little rat-faced man poured 3 glasses. The zealous Mr. Sorg held his untouched until he had seen the host drink his own personal glass to the final drop. Then Mr. Sorg drank his and smacked his lips. Inspector Val, more confident of more polite, kept the host company in his drinking. "And now," said the latter, "tell me why, when you are not an aeronaut, you masqueraded as such, Professor Reed, and trolled me into my meeting you." "You mistake the case, Mr. Seton. You trolled yourself. However, let me tell you what brings us to your home." "I shall be pleased to hear, sir. I will premise by saying that Mr. Sorg and myself possess no official powers in your state. That is of small consequence, however, since our purpose is not to make an arrest, but an investigation. Yesterday, when we talked, you covered up one truth. You've gone much further in perfecting your airship than you admitted. I was afraid you might have taken advantage of my discoveries, protested the little man apologetically. Now, when I understand that you are not professionals and know nothing and probably care nothing about aeronautics, it is a different matter. It is unimportant. The point is this Tuesday night, a week ago, you had out your airship and made an excursion as far eastward, at least as Fordham Heights. You are right. The experiments of that evening, for first experiments, were extremely successful, although I cannot imagine how you managed to observe them, for the night was quite dark. Let me ask a question. The little man glanced up expectantly. He was refilling Inspector Val's glass, his talon of a hand as steady as a tree. Did you know that you killed a man that night on Fordham Heights? Killed a man? The dry terror of the thought reduced the rasping cackle to a husky croak. The rat-like eyes filled up with a slow horror. Then it was a man my grappling iron caught? The little man sank to the floor as though stricken. Inspector Val lifted him and placed him in his chair. A bottle of Burgundy fell and broke on the stone hearth, the purple wine running about in the ashes. After a moment, the little man was able to partially command himself. Brushing back the lank, iron-gray locks, he looked vacantly at Inspector Val. Then his eyes dropped, and he began to shiver. To think that I've caused a fellow creature's death, he whispered. Inspector Val attempted the part of comforter. It was a sad accident, but when all is said, only an accident. This will end it. I shall do no more. Inspector Val let the little man wander on without an interruption. Presently, when the latter's composure had somewhat returned, he recommenced gently. Why not tell what happened? I will do my best, returned the little man, making an effort. Of course, in a general way, you understand about balloons. The two big questions with aeronautic world are how to control a balloon so as to travel at will to any given place and the teeth of winds, if need be. Next, having arrived at your destination, how do you manage a safe descent? I think I have solved those questions. Certainly, I can control my machine, taking it whether I will at times when the wind does not exceed 8 miles per hour, a fair breeze. My theory was perfect, my machine complete, and on that fatal night, it being both dark and still, I resolved upon a thorough test. I was in the air 2 hours and my device for controlling the airship worked admirably. I could drive it where I would. And this, interrupted Inspector Val, pointing to the model of the electric machine, is the engine you control it with. It's the device itself, said the little man, his sallow cheek reddening with revived interest. He crossed over. See, said he, indicating the big four-flanged fan. The engine will drive this contrivance 20,000 revolutions a minute. You know something of air pressures and forces of wind. I could give you a formula, but it's enough since you are not scientific to say that this device, driven to top power, will exert a force of 400 pounds. Although you will observe that the fan or propeller arrangement works on a ball and socket joint, I can turn it up or down or horizontal. In brief, it can be used to lift or lower the airship as well as drive it on its way. I think I understand, said Inspector Val, assuming a sympathetic interest. Now, to return to your experimental trip. The cheek of the man whitened anew, while his eyes resumed their troubled look of sorrow. I will give all I possess if I had never made it, he said. However, let me come at once to the worst. I had been east as far as the Sound, and was on my way return as I floated over the intervening tongue of the land between the Sound and the Harlem River. The shaft that drives the propeller began to get hot. A collar was too tight. I was no more than 100 feet above the ground. As I didn't know the extent of the trouble, I deemed it best to descend. Having halted the airship, I could loosen the collar with a twist of the wrench. I have a half-inch drag rope with a grappling hook at the end. The rope passes through the bottom of the car and can be lowered or hauled in at will. When fully out, it is 80 feet long. I had all but stopped the driving gear and was floating westward by the mere motion of the air. I saw a big house, and beyond it, quite a distance, stood a clumpy tree with a free space all about it. I hoped to pass over the tree and entangle my grappling hook in its branches. This would bring my airship to a halt. I could then lower it to the ground with safety. Some such notion crossed my mind, interjected Inspector Val, the moment I set eyes on that dogwood. I could see the tree quite plainly, resumed the little man, because of the snow. I had let down my drag rope full length and was expecting with each moment to feel it comb the tree when all of a sudden came a mighty tug, tilting the airship, and within I heard a scream. I had noticed nothing below but the tree. The tug of the drag rope and an awful cry startled me horribly. In my agitation, I did two things, both wrong. I started the propeller full ahead, at the same time emptying out my sand ballast. The balloon, while still keeping up its slow drift westward, rose rapidly, for aside from throwing overboard the ballast, the propeller's shaft had been raised to a perpendicular, and in that position, going full ahead, it exerted, as I've told you, a lifting force of 400 pounds. You knew, of course, broke in Inspector Val, that some live creature was being carried aloft on your grappling hook. By no means. My thought was that the creature had freed itself. To be candid, while my ideas were by no means clear, I took it from the cry as well as the surroundings to be a sheep. After that first scream, that was with the whir and flutter of the fan, I could hear nothing. I didn't touch the drag rope until I was fairly over the Harlem. It was free then, and you say, observed the little man, a catch of his throat like a sob. You say it was a man? You carried him 200 yards in the air before the grappling hook released him through the tearing of his coat. His body, crushed to a pulp by the fall, was found near the railway track. The little man squeezed his claw-like hands between his knees while his face worked with regret and grief. I shall make amends to his family, he said. As much as one may with money, I shall make amends, though it take the last dollar of my fortune. He was wholly without family. But tell me, why didn't you return after you got control of yourself and your airship? I was prodigiously shaking, so much so that I wholly forgot the tight collar and the hot shaft. I only thought of getting home. I made the journey without mishap, and it is no more than 3 miles as the crow flies from here to Fordham Heights. But you must surely have thought that that poor creature torn by the grappling hook. Think of it, yes, but I had no doubt that it was a sheep. I could do no more good by returning, and I feared to expose my invention. It was to hide what I had been doing until my designs were perfect, that I came to this out-of-the-way place. I was afraid if I went back that it would result in a newspaper story before I was ready for it. You may be sure that I realized the truth. I should have returned to either repair the wrong or bear the blame. Let me see your airship, said Inspector Val, getting to his feet. I know where it is. I have already reconned that narrow building in the hollow. You may see it, and welcome. The more, since you are likely to be the last, besides myself, to look upon it. The little man was utterly depressed, and his shoulders had taken on an added droop. He lit a lantern and led the way to that slim, tall structure in the hollow. Once there, he unlocked and threw open the wide doors. The balloon proper, a long cigar-shaped contrivance of oiled silk, wholly filled the upper part of the narrow building. The little man showed his gas-making arrangements and explained that he had inflated it just before Inspector Val and Mr. Sorg arrived, having planned another experimental trip that very night. "It is so clear a night," he said, "that I intended to defer starting till about 2 in the morning. I thought I would only circle about the countryside. I wanted to avoid notice for another month or two." Inspector Val examined the car. It was wicker work, and the material used in the weaving had been first sheathed in rubber. "The car contrivance is aluminum," explained the little man. "The idea was to combine lightness with strength. Car engine, drag rope, ballast, with myself aboard, weigh under 400 pounds. Fully charged, the lifting power of the balloon itself is almost 500. This is aside from what help can instantly be given by rising the fan shaft to perpendicular." The little man gazed steadily and sadly at his darling device for selling the sky. "It has been a friend and family to me. More, it was my religion, my God. I have sacrificed to it thousands of money, years of thought, and now the end." The little man covered his face with his thin hands. It was thus that Inspector Val and Mr. Sorg left him when they came away. The bays stood waiting, full of impatience. In a moment, they were whirling away for Fort Lee. "That was a silken piece of work," observed Mr. Sorg. Simplicity itself. For all the complacent modesty of the utterance, Mr. Sorg could tell that Inspector Val was pleased with himself. All it required was a little thought. To begin with, I was obliged to decline Burke's theory of a fiend, nor could I see my way to adopt your ingenious suggestion of a condor. Assuming that Settle had been carried off, manner and form, as Mr. Burke's related, there was but one solution. It was done by a balloon. There could be nothing else within the realm of the sane and possible. Mr. Burke's fluttering of mighty wings aided the thought. Also, I considered the character of the night, quiet and dark, and even took in the dogwood tree, some airship drifting low or about to descend. The open space was an argument for the latter, had caught Settle with its steel three-pronged grappling hook. Thus I argued, while looking at the tracks in the snow, when I saw his body and found the long, deep gash in the back and shoulder, I regarded it as sure. "And naturally," interjected Mr. Sorg, in an ecstasy of admiration, "the next move was to locate the air sailor." This was indubitably the next step. There had been no late newspaper talk of any local airship, and came to the conclusion that some ambitious aeronaut must have built himself a machine and was experimenting in secret. Being secret, he had waited until after dark before beginning his voyage that night. Settle was swooped on at 10 o'clock. The airship could not have been up 4 hours, with some little breeze stirring and afloat. So short of time, the airship must have been, when it killed Settle, within 12 miles from the place of starting. The chances were that the distance was even less. There then was my problem, to discover an aeronaut who was, so to call it, in hiding within a radius of a dozen miles from Fordham Heights. A look at the map will show that description embraces quite a bit of country. One may say so. There were a score of methods in which should have found my man, but most of them meant time, and it was the short cut I was after. You know what inventors are: intense, eager, swallowed up by their own project. Figuring on my hidden aeronaut as being such another individual as this, Mr. Seaton, I caused a local item to be printed in the American. The great aeronaut of Europe is the English scientist Professor Reed, and for the purpose of my notice, I stole that sky traveler's name. The item ran after this sort: Professor Reed, the celebrated aeronaut, is quartered at the Hoffman. He comes from Berlin, where he has been in the conference with the German Emperor, a potentate who is profoundly taken up with air navigation. While France has interested herself in submarines, the Kaiser means to perfect the airship. It is understood that Professor Reed has agreed to design an airship for the Germans that shall be as much under control in the air as a ship in the water. The idea was, continued Inspector Val, that my fellow aeronaut would see this, and I reckoned on a call from him, birds of a feather, Sorg. Besides, he would come not on Professor Reed's account, but his own, and on the chance of picking up a hint that should help him along with his device. Nor was I wrong. I got a letter at the Hoffman proposing an interview. This was signed Mr. Notes, and asked me to address my correspondent at the St. Denis. Notes, broke Mr. Sorg, contemptuous. That was deep, deep indeed. However, I sent a letter to Mr. Notes at the St. Denis and made the appointment yesterday. Our friend came sharp to the minute, and he had the most interesting half hour with him. What result you've seen. But why did he change his name? Why did he skulk and glance back to see if he were followed? Doesn't it look as though he knew he'd killed someone? That was my first thought. I now believe his explanation. He couldn't have acted that part tonight. He's too innocent, too guileless. No, we were the first to let him hear of the blood he'd shed. As for his alias and his skulking, inventors are egotists to the point of insanity. This Seaton, I warrant you, thinks himself of his and of his airship that the two most important things in the world, and was afraid, as he himself said, that a fellow scientist might not be above privily following him with a larcenous purpose of poaching. There will be no arrest. There will be no crime. Certainly the facts would hardly justify a requisition of the governor of Trenton, to say nothing of dragging into court that poor old man whose troubles are like to kill him as it is. It means the end of his beloved airship. You remember what he said, it is the end. And it is the end, cried Mr. Sorg, suddenly pulling the elbow of Inspector Val. Look there. They had wheeled into the main road and were bowling along a good mile or more from the cottage. Inspector Val cast his eye to the right and to the rear in the direction indicated by Mr. Sorg. The heavens were painted a bright gold now and then. A serpent tongue of flame licked upwards toward the stars. Back, cried Inspector Val. The disgusted bays came round at a trot and were again headed for the cottage. Before half the distance had been covered, the bright orange light began to fail and fade, and when they reached the cottage, the airship and the tinder-like structure that had sheltered it were merely glowing coals and embers. Mr. Seaton they found in the room where they first saw him, gazing into the log fire in sadly brooding eyes. The stricken old man, leaden of eye, cheek of chalk, looked up at Inspector Val, came in with Mr. Sorg. He evinced no surprise at their return. It was I, he said, as though answering a question. It was I who did it. I put a torch to it myself. This has been Tracks in the Snow, written by Alfred Henry Lewis, narrated by Conan Stewart, or Tales Reawakened on YouTube.